Thanks again for getting up this morning and doing this presentation. In a 1935 essay titled Heritage or Modernism, Constants in Art Forms, H.P. Lovecraft puts forth an argument in defense of traditional art styles, and thereby censures those ones he characterizes by their pretensions to intense levels of novelty. As a shorthand, he refers to these innovative styles and productions as modernism, and as concrete examples of the art he means to refer to by this term, he cites Gertrude Stein, Wilcox, James Joyce, and others. He criticizes these artists for their belief that, quote, all art ought to be divorced completely from tradition, from earlier art forms, unquote. In response to the belief he attributes to these innovators of art, he scolds, quote, remove all sources of familiarity, all the subtle landmarks implied by what we know of the past, and no phase of art or life. And no phase of art or life can have more than the slenderest vestige of appeal, beauty, or meaning. The subjective quality of familiarity and the intersubjective one of formal convention, Lovecraft aligns with traditional art forms, and in his enthusiasm elevates them to existential proportions. Quote, there can be no such thing as value, purpose, direction, or meaning, or even interest except in a strictly local and relative sense. In large part, Lovecraft's scarecrow modernism and heritage or modernism is a distortion based less on an actual understanding of historical modernism, a largely academic creation fraught with contradictions, and more on a stereotype inevitably derived from experiencing modernist works out of their contexts, disassociated from the interpretive communities that understood their unique idiom. For example, one of Lovecraft's essay's central premises, modernism's antagonistic relationship to tradition, is highly problematic. It does not take into consideration the extent to which many of the artists typically designated as modernists in classical and contemporary studies were concerned primarily not with severing their ties to artistic tradition, but with the problem of reinvigorating that tradition. But Lovecraft's inaccurate rendition of historical modernism is of scant interest here when compared to his fictionalized modernism, a fiction that, when properly scrutinized, yields a rich theory of art. As we know, many of Lovecraft's short stories feature artists as characters who produce art, clearly marked as severed from established aesthetic traditions, and can in this way be interpreted as quasi-modernists. Furthermore, unlike Lovecraft's many expository-style polemics and humorous parodies, where he censures modernism directly, my favorite, of course, is On Waste Paper. It's a parody of T.S. Eliot's On Wasteland. Lost my place. This literary discourse featuring fictional modernists allows him to preserve the rich complexities of his reflections on modernist art. But unlike critical discourse, generally taken on the level of the denotative, literary discourse operating through connotation and allegoric resonances asks for responsible translation. This is what I propose to do. I highlight a few key examples of what I call Lovecraft's quasi-modernists. I drop the quasi for convenience, and the modernist art they create at their and our peril. I then trace a loose aesthetic theory these fictional artists and art objects outline. I argue that modernist artistic effort in these key instances is portrayed as a form of occult research, a struggle to perceive the cosmos at large, to bring into scale a human being. In briefly concluding, contrary to statements of heritage and modernism, I argue that these stories portray a hitherto undocumented intimacy, linking the aesthetic strategies typically associated with modernist aesthetics with those associated with cosmic horror, of which Lovecraft is master. Although many characters featured in earlier Lovecraft stories manifest the acute sensibilities of artists, or are directly portrayed as artists, for example, Jervis Dudley in The Tomb, Joe Slater, Beyond the Wall of Sleep, Crawford Tillinghast from Beyond, Randolph Carter, of course, from The Dream Cycle, Ironon. None of them can be interpreted firmly as quasi-modernist until the strange violist of the music of Erich Zann. In this story, the narrator, lodging on the fifth story of the house on the strange Rue d'Alceste, comes into contact with the decrepit hermit, Erich Zann, who lives in an attic garret of the same house, a violist who is described as possessing highly original genius. Consider how Zann's music is described as being disconnected from all previous traditions of music familiar to the narrator. Quote, I was haunted by the weirdness of his music. Knowing little of art myself, I was yet certain that none of his harmonies had any relation to music I had heard before. It is implied that Zann's strange musical enterprise is a kind of transgression that has attracted the attention of a hostile force, manifested as a horrible dissonance, a force that can only be kept at bay but never defeated by Zann's playing. When it arrives, it threatens to drown out Zann's music, whereas Zann's music is complex, its opposing music is cruelly simple, is described as, quote, a shriller, steadier note from from the viol, not from the viol, a calm, deliberate, purposeful, mocking note from away in the west. At the end of the story, Zann fails in warding off the entity, and as a result, something horrible happens that the narrator registers as a visual phenomenon beyond the attic window. Quote, when I looked from the highest of all gable windows, looked while the candle sputtered and the insane viol howled, I saw no city spread below, no friendly lights gleaming from remembered streets, but only the blackness of space illimitable. End quote. Here we have displayed in literary discourse an idea Lovecraft proposed elsewhere in a critical register. Quote, there can be no such thing as value, purpose, direction, or meaning, or even interest, except in a local and relative sense. We can interpret this story as an inaugural instance of Lovecraft's fictionalization of the modernist artist who, striking out into new, original aesthetic realms, transgresses, and through the transgression of his artistic enterprise, Zann has brought upon himself and the narrator the reality of humanity's existence in a hostile a universe where the local and relative fictions of our significance, morality, and personal projects lose much of their validity, or all their validity. Here in a thinly allegorical register, Lovecraft suggests the responsibilities associated with the artist. The artist as steward of human meaning in a cosmos hostile to it. From this perspective, the figure of Zann holds in tension an idealized and a cynical vision of the artist typically associated with modernism. One, the idealized vision of the artist as antagonist to chaos, often associated with modernity, and the cynical vision of the artist as impotent in a standoff with this chaos. Consider the narrator's description of Zann as he plays in agonizing opposition to the musical entity that heralds a hostile cosmos. Quote, it would be useless to describe the playing of Erich Zann on that dreadful night. It was more horrible than I had ever overheard because I could now see the expression on his face and could realize at this time the motive was stark fear. Many stories following the music of Erich Zann feature artists whose artistic enterprise takes them beyond established aesthetic traditions. Artists like the unnamed narrator of Hypnos, the sculptor and his companion, who's transformed into a statue, instill intense subjective feeling into a kind of scientific project referred to as, quote, impious explorations that are indescribable for want of symbols or suggestions in any language, end quote. The narrator of The Hound and his companion St. John construct grotesque art objects out of skeletons, play music on nauseous musical instruments, embark on predatory excursions to gather tomb loot, described as, quote, artistically memorable events, end quote. And it is significant that these transgressive activities are undertaken in response to their boredom with previously established aesthetic movements. Of course, the figure Randolph Carter can be brought up, and by slightly reframing his fictional theory of indescribability depicted in The Unnameable, he can be seen as struggling with the same exigencies as those frequently cited as those of the modernists, the challenges associated with the task of aestheticizing or even describing novelty as such in a disenchanted modern world pervaded by novelty. But I would move on to another fictional modernist whose strange sculpture holds in tension familiarity and novelty, Henry Wilcox of Call of Cthulhu. Wilcox is introduced as an intensely innovative artist, a radical figure who has been expelled from the Providence Art Club because it was, quote, anxious to preserve its conservatism, end quote. The narrative of the Call of Cthulhu begins to unfold when Wilcox brings a singular bas-relief sculpture adorned with strange hieroglyphics to an archaeological expert. It is in this fictional exchange between Professor Angel, the archaeologist, and Henry Wilcox, the modernist, that we can see Lovecraft has fully sharpened his idiom for reflecting on modernist art, the modernist artist, and the relationship of the artist in general to human society and the cosmos at large. Let us begin with Wilcox's strange art object, the skull. This sculpture holds in vibrating tension antiquity and novelty. It is equally ancient and modern, deriving from the just now, the night before. It is described as exceedingly damp and fresh, and yet manifests dreams, quote, older than brooding tiring. Now let us turn to Wilcox. He describes himself as psychically hypersensitive, and in response to certain geologic disturbances, has a dream of cyclopean cities of titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister flaming roar, end quote. Professor Angel, after analyzing Wilcox, undertakes a broader study of other artists similarly affected, and in this way he makes a discovery that during the length of the geologic disturbance that inspired Wilcox, many other sensitive people were affected, particularly in Paris, France. It is related that in Paris, quote, a famous painter named Ardois Bonnet hangs a blasphemous dream landscape in the Paris Spring Salon of 1926, end quote. The left bank of Paris was, of course, one of the epicenters of Anglo-American modernist artistic production in the early 20s, as well as an important headquarters of the continental European avant-garde. Although this extra literary fact of history should not very much interpret weight in the context of translating properly literary discourse, it is nevertheless suggestive, I am convinced, that Lovecraft triangulates Wilcox in relation to what the author and other cultural elites would have understood as a hotbed of experimental artistic activity. Following the narrative logic of the story from beginning to end, Wilcox's fevered midnight aesthetic enterprise, his creation of sculptural art disconnected from previous established tradition, results in the terrible revelation of Cthulhu we are familiar with. Like the single dissonant note that conquers Zann, Cthulhu is an avatar who indexes the cosmos at large and thereby scales humanity down, shatters its illusions of importance, and claims its significance. Thus, like Erich Zann, the unnamed artist of Hypnos, the artist of the Hound, and others, Wilcox is a modernist who appears to break with all aesthetic traditions in the task of creating novelty. But Wilcox's art is marked in a way that diverges from previous fictional modernist art in Lovecraft's oeuvre. Unlike the fictional art treated earlier, Wilcox's strange sculpture binds together geologic time and human time. Put another way, it takes human experience based on the flow of personal time as a point of departure and violently expands it to the levels of the cosmos. The last of Lovecraft's fictional modernists I treat here is Richard Upton Pickman, an imaginary artist from which we can extract the outline of a mature and complex vision of actual aesthetic enterprise in modernity. Pickman is, for all intents and purposes, an experimental artist. Consider the narrator Thurber's description of Pickman's work. Quote, "There is no use trying to tell what they were like, because the awful, the blasphemous horror, and the unbelievable loathsomeness of moral theater came from simple touches quite beyond the power of words to classify." End quote. Like Zann's music and many other examples of the tradition-free fictional art depicted by Lovecraft, Pickman's work is unfamiliar to such a pitch that it cannot be exhibited, a situation referred to by Thurber. Quote, "As you know, the club wouldn't exhibit it, and the Museum of Fine Arts wouldn't accept it as a gift, and I can add that nobody would buy it, and so Pickman had it right in his house till he went." End quote. But it comes into sharp focus in this story. A point vaguely outlined in the Call of Cthulhu is the nature of the relationship of the modernist artist to history and tradition, a relationship that can be seen clearly in the narrator's exploration of Pickman's private art collection at Costco. After a nighttime trek across Boston to Pickman's North End studio, the demented artist displays for Thurber his paintings depicting the witch and ghoul-haunted New England past. After being stirred to his core by those depictions of dog-faced ghoul changelings haunting Puritan homes and hearths, Pickman asked if Thurber would like to see his modern studies. Thurber is affected by the alteration of historical context and describes his reaction in this way. Quote, "I just about recovered my wind and got used to those frightful pictures, which turned colonial New England into a kind of annex of hell. Well, in spite of all this, that next room forced a real scream out of me, and I had to clutch at the doorway to keep from keeling over. The other chamber had shown a pack of ghouls and witches overrunning the world of our forefathers, but this one brought the horror right into our daily life." End quote. What this suggests is that modernist art depicts in this story, the modernist art Lovecraft depicts in this story only appears to be disconnected from established traditions. In this story, the bizarre, indescribable characteristics of modernist art, in spite of their tradition-free appeal, actually interface with history. But the history they interface with is of a cosmic scale, the traditions of an extra-human culture. In other words, the modernist who deviates from established traditions of aesthetic production in this view does not create something new at all, but simply turns away from what Clark Ashton Smith termed the human aquarium, to face directly the totality of the cosmos, the oldest tradition there is. In bringing the ghoul-haunted New England past into the present day, Pickman, and perhaps even Lovecraft, become prototypical modernists, manifesting acutely what T.S. Eliot termed in, quote, the historical sense, in his tradition in the individual town. And then I close with just a quotation from T.S. Eliot's essay. The historical sense involves a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. The historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with a feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe, from Homer, and within it the whole of the literature of his own country, has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. Thank you.